Joanna Macy, the great environmental activist and systems ecologist, said that when faced with planetary crisis, there are three stories we can tell ourselves. Business as usual, in which we tell ourselves that some degree of damage is necessary for human progress. The great unraveling, in which we tell ourselves that mass ecosystem destruction is inevitable. And the great turning, in which we tell ourselves that evolving the way we live is the only way forward, and that we're at the beginning of one of the great projects in human history. On this podcast, we talk to people who are writing that third story, with their own work and their own lives. Mission-driven leaders who are dedicated to social and environmental impact at this critical moment for our species. Welcome to The Turning Point. We've had a few guests lately from the regenerative agriculture movement, and we've heard them talk about technical solutions, financial solutions, and market-based solutions. Robbie Vitrano is the board chair at Mad Agriculture. They support farmers and land stewards in all those areas. But as Robbie says, their approach to the regenerative transition is at its core about healing the relationship between people and the land. As our previous guests have made clear, the day-to-day effort to reform our food production system has no choice but to operate within the incentive structure of the modern economy. And Robbie Vitrano and his friends at Mad Agriculture have no illusions about that. But as you'll hear in the conversation, they view technical knowledge, capital, and market making merely as tools. And they start every project by asking, what does the land want to be? And then applying all of their tools to partner with land stewards and build human food systems that work with Earth ecosystems. If you've been paying attention, then you know that the stakes are high when it comes to reforming food production at large. And learning about the work of an org like Mad Agriculture is both grounding and hopeful. With that, on to the interview with Robbie Vitrano. All right, Robbie Vitrano, welcome to The Turning Point.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
All right, so if you could start with a high-level description of Mad Agriculture in terms of what the philosophy is and what their particular point of view is on the regenerative transition.
Sure. At the highest level, Mad Ag's work is sparking the regenerative agriculture revolution. That there's a lot to be said about what that really means, but that's the core, that's the focus. We accomplish that in our relationship with land stewards, farmers, and ranchers. And working in a highly collaborative way with those land stewards, beginning with a very fundamental question: what does this land want to be? And then, of course, you're bringing in the intentionality of the land steward themselves. It's highly contextual. It's entirely bioregional. It varies. There are circumstances that involve things like succession planning and previous generations and all sort of realizations and pressures. But the idea is to sort of arrive at a level set of sorts and an understanding of those things that allows for us to ultimately start to orchestrate a movement from where they are today towards, more regenerative practices on land. So that's what we do each and every day. On a philosophical level, kind of our theory of change, if you will, which our executive director carries so beautifully, we believe that the revolution needs to be delicious and irresistible. I mean, we really need to make sure that at its core, it's invitational, it's entirely collaborative, it's interdependent, it's sacred. So, oftentimes, in contrast to that, you recognize there's a lot of beautiful science, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of dogma in this transition. It can get politicized, it can get hot pretty quickly. And the recognition is that we really need to hold space for that sacred, which ultimately is the healing of the relationship between people and nature. That's really our work. So that kind of captures what we do on an everyday basis. And then there's a philosophical wrapper that we're continuing to evolve and iterate and learn from, and hopefully share and expand upon as well.
All right, I like that statement of philosophy about healing the relationship between people and the land.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great place to start. So maybe there are two ways to ask this question. And the question is, what are the biggest obstacles to healing that relationship? And I guess one way to ask that is, what are the obstacles? And I guess the other one is, what are the obstacles that you guys focus on resolving?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the obstacles to healing that relationship between people and nature, it's complicated. And I'd say, to oversimplify, it's because of the economics involved in it. There's a big muscular system that does exactly what it was designed to do. Certainly going back to the Industrial Revolution and to the agricultural, the Green Revolution, in terms of our ability to recognize how to optimize resource, optimize probably deserves some air quotes. Try to keep that to a limit. We don't want to overdo that, but we can go
Right.
there. But the idea of systems that were focused on yield and volume productivity. So the problem was framed as, how do we make it easier to grow lots of food to make it available for a growing population? And business did what business did, essentially creating a assembly line approach to agriculture. The only problem there is that it doesn't quite recognize nature and natural systems and what's necessary to not only achieve those results, arguably, but also to maintain the intentions of those results. Not only the yield, the number of calories generated, but the ability to sustain the generation of calories that are nourishing to our bodies, of course, that's
Mm-hmm.
a driver, but also that are recognizing that all of those systems are entirely dependent on a very intricate, interdependent, ecosystem of actors. Nature has been doing it for a long time, kind of understands it. So we've gotten away from it, again, to kind of oversimplify. And our job is to help reacquaint to that and make the case for it. And that transition away from an efficiency driven model, a yield driven model, to one that recognizes the way that the parts of that system play together, the interdependence and the ecology that they're in, and as well as benefits that sit in the adjacencies to that we all recognize we need, like clean air, like biodiversity, like healthy natural ecosystems, wild ecosystems. All of those that sit in proximity to this manipulation of land are also considerations. But if we just kind of start with the fundamental idea of how do we continue to produce food that is nourishing for us, that's good for the planet, that's good for humanity, that's good for culture, that's good for society, and that can live within an economic system. That's what we're advocating for, and that's what we're creating plans and programming and allocating resources for the purpose of achieving those objectives. The obstacle now is there's a lot of money. There's a lot of incentive around how those bets have been placed, the sunk costs that are involved in that, the economic implications for people who are involved in the orchestration of that system on a day in, day out basis, as well as the many, many more that are detached from the consequences of that system, but that are looking for a return, the markets. All of those things are oftentimes in tension or in conflict with the idea of returning to a more regenerative agricultural system. So our job is to make it clear, make it visible, make it attractive to people, allow for it to be implemented, and at the same time, make that business case as we go through it. The final thing I'll say in the context of that is, oftentimes when you discuss it in that kind of strategic way, you miss some of the stuff that we just know we need to be paying attention to. It's the data can oftentimes obscure the fact that we intuitively understand that this is the right way to behave. We get lost so often in this, and again, that kind of contributes to what we began the conversation with. That oftentimes shows up in the way that we sort of remove ourselves from an interdependent system, a necessary interdependent system, into these silos. We become reductionist in our thinking because intuitively that's how we, efficiently optimize a solution. But in doing so, we divorce ourselves from the system thinking, and in many ways, we remove ourselves from the solution. So we're carrying a few different things in those lanes, but it starts, like I said, with walking that land in that context, with some understanding of what has come before that, the indigenous wisdom on that land, the systems that are at work within that land, recognizing that, giving it a name, and then putting our heads together with intention, deciding how we're going to start to work that plan.
I want to ask a quick question, Robbie, from you. Like, obviously, you've been doing this work for several years, and there are many obstacles to it. And as you're talking, this interdependent, complex environment, right, where we're trying to make change. Like, one thing that I've experienced in my forays into regenerative ag is it's really easy to paint the farmer or the land steward with a broad brush, right, and
Yeah.
say their practices are good or their practices are bad. I'm not necessarily asking that. I'm curious, like, as you've been doing this work over the years, how have you seen the appetite of those land stewards, no pun intended, how have you seen their appetite for change kind of evolve? You know, like, how aware would you say they are of this bigger picture, and how reticent are they to make these changes, or are they eager to do so?
Yeah, it's a great question, and just the idea of, again, the dogmatic or the binary, yes, good or bad, it really is useless. I mean, just pick any direction. You can point north, south, east, west, politics, etc. We got to stay out of the gutter on the left and the right. There's some good work to be done, and it's not about being in the middle of the road. It's about the collaboration. It's the murmuration. So, the agricultural space, many farmers come, from a conservative bent, and there's a lot of legacy within that. There's a lot of things that, they've learned through the years. And mostly that's motivated by the fact that it's hard work. It's very, very hard work. Even farmers who own their land are cash flow poor, even if they do have assets in terms of the land that they own. Many other farmers are leasing that land. So cash flow is really, really important to them. And as you said, they're entirely burdened. And so many of the solutions, as we, sit in our homes or push a cart through a supermarket, is like, what that farmer needs to be doing. That farmer's got a long to-do list. It's a really long to-do list. I don't know if we can use F-bombs, but that was one that it required a little bit of that superlative. But the idea of the receptiveness, the appetite, as you say, yeah, it's absolutely growing, again, I think that's another sort of flag towards, or a tip towards, the fact that people are trying to make sense of it from a market standpoint. There's a lot of energies in trying to create incentives, whether biodiversity incentives or carbon incentives or a premium in the marketplace. I'm going to pay 30% more for an apple because it's regeneratively grown as opposed to, a conventionally grown apple. There's some problem. There's some hair on those solutions, and we're a long way from resolving those. And maybe more importantly, we're a long way away from taking that idea, that beautiful, elegant idea that exists in theory, and going over to a farmer that has to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and telling them, here's a really good reason for you to do things differently. So it matters, and we need to work on it, but it's not going to be the big motivator. I think what you're finding, Ian, is that there's such an intrinsic motivation on the part of these land stewards. They've always recognized the land. It's very rare to meet anyone that doesn't have a sense of reverence for the land, that has an understanding of what's at stake and where they fit into a bigger picture. And land steward, there are probably some people that are pretty grippy about my land and, a very Yellowstone kind of thing. But I think most farmers understand that, we're on this earth for a certain amount of time, and this land is eternal. So my role, and either previous generation, we're here to make sure that we do the right by this land, and we do the right things on the land. So increasingly, those land stewards, those farmers, are recognizing that they're seeing their land, they're seeing their soil deteriorate, they're seeing climate conditions, whether it's drought or whether it's intense heat or whether it's access to water and water resources. They can't avoid those things. They're incredibly attuned to those elements. They're attuned to features they see in terms of wildlife and the participation there and the health of their grass, etc. So, more and more farmers, you're hearing from them, the idea that, their job is the soil, right? I mean, they are farmers of soil, and they get that right, and then the other things flow from it. The other big leverage point, and not to overplay the idea, because I think sometimes it becomes a cliche, but that, this generation, whether it's Z or whomever, is more attuned to these ideas, that they are able to sort of understand within the system there are other things at stake and they have a regard and there are consequences to them. But that's another real dynamic. So it certainly amplifies the conversation and some of the motives. But where it really lands, and it always lands here, is young farmers aren't picking up the mantle, right? So it's like, where's the next generation going to go? And it's a very distressing thing for thousands and thousands of farmers who are losing their land, who are facing challenges financially, who are being asked to do more burdened by it, to really orchestrate a succession plan. And, in years past, I mean, we now have such a fraction, such a tiny, tiny sliver of farmers still on the land. And again, maybe that's to be expected in the world of automation and all the wonderful technologies in the world. But increasingly, it's becoming harder for that succession to be enacted in a way where everybody feels good about it, everybody feels the opportunity. You can't blame a guy who's been on the land, or a woman that's been on the land for years, who's been working really, really hard all day, all night. Their body's a bit broken up by it, and saying, I'm sitting on some assets here. I'm gonna sell this land. I'm gonna get my reward from all this hard work. And some of those tickets are pretty big tickets. So the good news is that more and more farmers are saying, yes, we will lean into this problem, and they do. Oftentimes, I mean, you'll hear these statistics about how much more their costs are related to any kind of incentive program in order to participate in it. This is where our responsibility again comes in. What MadAg does, and there are other people that do this type of work as well, but what we're deeply dedicated to is when that land steward is bringing in that idea that they wish to go deeper into that stewardship, that accountability, that responsibility, that's where we're all hands on deck. What we have available within our resources, within our agronomic resources, within our market making resources, within our access to capital, and within our partnerships, to help them develop a plan that gives them some confidence to start to work that, so that they use that institutional knowledge and experience in a way that ultimately, again, continues to heal the land and achieve the objectives we're all looking for in regenerative.
Okay, so we've got some difficult and sometimes narrow economic incentives at a high level, right?
Very
But
high.
you're saying
Yeah.
we also have a lot of farmers, a lot of landowners who are willing, and they're aware, and they're motivated, and they're dealing with those economic challenges. So maybe you could get a little more specific with us about what are some of the ways Mad Agriculture actually supports them and helps them do the right thing.
Yeah, and this is kind of the second level of what MadAg does. So, at our core, we are a nonprofit. We're a 501c3. Mad Agriculture is the original organization that was founded by Phil and Nicole. And the organization essentially uses philanthropic dollars primarily to provide agronomic and technical assistance to the farmers. Not a big secret. But farmers aren't exactly the greatest customer in the world, not because they're not great people. It's just they just don't have a whole lot more money. So it's not like you're going to go in. I'm sure you guys, when you go out and do your consulting work, you're $1,000 an hour, you're McKinsey guys or whatever it is. But nice idea, but no, that's not happening when you're providing agronomic services. But the beauty of that work is that it acquaints us so deeply with the problems that we're trying to address, right? So everyone knows as an entrepreneur, the primary idea is to understand the user case, to understand the dynamics associated with the problems and opportunities that you wish to address. And that's something we're really, really good at. We are an entrepreneurial organization, first and foremost, dedicated to that innovation. And the ability for us to be on the land and gathering up and working in collaboration with the wisdom that's preceded those existing land stewards, as well as what they've gained in their own experience, and to use that to more crisply define the problems that we're trying to solve and the ones that need greater attention and greater sophistication and amplification has allowed us to address those problems, Justin. So at the core, it is developing a coherent farm plan, one that pencils out. It generally doesn't pencil out next week or next month or maybe even next year. So it's also understanding what's involved, what that runway looks like. That's a very important space. Easy to say, right? But most people, the world in general, is working at cycles that are inorganic, right? I mean, whether it's
Hmm.
quarterly reporting or earnings reports or even political cycles, there's all kind of features and factors out there that have nothing to do with the rhythm of nature. But we understand that these factors do need more time to breathe and to be understood as to what those commitments require to ultimately, yield results, yield, incentives for the farmer. So we're also, as a result of our time on the land, we've been able to generate two for-profit investor-backed companies. The first is Mad Capital. Mad Capital was designed specifically to provide financing that's aligned with that transition. So it's properly patient. It's interest only in the early stages until the land starts to achieve its true potential. And that understanding of what it takes to get there is informed by our agronomic services. So, in effect, not only were we able to understand and design that problem to design a solution and create an independent entity, an autonomous entity that's in our family, but separate from Mad Ag to address that problem, but it also allows for Mad Ag, as part of our brotherhood and our collaboration with our sister companies, to also provide a bit of underwriting for that, right? So we have an understanding of, the things that a bank would use as an underwriter to understand not only the business case, but the character of the individual who's committing themselves to it. That used to be a thing in the banking world, right? Character was one of those C's that a banker used to do. You got to go back to Jimmy Stewart to find it, but maybe not Jamie Dimon so much, but other people. And then the other piece to that puzzle to address those challenges was the recognition of what you call the missing middle, or we call the messy middle, which is that infrastructure that allows for a grower or a rancher to plan their day with some understanding of an off taker, someone that's going to help them get that crop off that land into a package form, processed, sorted in a way that makes it as valuable as possible for the marketplace. So that market making that takes place. And that involves some really unsexy stuff that happened to be implemented by some really sexy people, some really cool visionary people. A guy like Dave Oyen, who was made famous in the Lentil Underground books, who recognized as a farmer, this was a farmer, this wasn't a guy who was carrying an MBA, but who said, if I don't create an infrastructure within this community of 100, 150 farmers and help them not only work with the crops that they're planting now, but some other crops that would help to promote the fertility of his soil and the health of his soil and work within that bioregion in Montana, I've got to create that infrastructure. I've got to go out and do that. So Dave rounded up a whole bunch of his buddies. They all kicked in some money. Some had a little more money to give than others. It's a motley crew of graybeards, but amazing people who committed themselves to that. And that story was replicated all over America. The agricultural system was dependent on these regional processors that help get that product to market so that the farmer could plan their year as well as make a couple of dollars. So that has been depleted by the industrial system. This is another consequence. So not only is the industrial system depleting soil and overusing, petrochemical inputs, misusing water and other things. There's a lot of maligning there. I don't want to really go there so much. That's not the point. But those things that we're recognizing that we need to change, those behaviors, the other consequences of that is that it's gutted rural communities. So when all that infrastructure disappears, those jobs disappear, the connectedness between the people who do that processing, who support one another, the farmer co-ops, we're losing something. And you don't have to look very far to find out where these things manifest, right? I mean, they're showing up in our politics when, there's an urban-rural divide, or when we think that, people are being talked down to or disparaged as a result of what they've committed themselves to. We're just disconnected from those relationships in such a way that we just have a little bit harder time finding that common ground and that connection. So there are consequences that go far beyond the economics of these regional systems. So one of the things we recognize is that we needed to get into the infrastructure business, which, by the way, is such a bad idea when it first comes up. It's like the first conversation you should not be having is how do we go out and buy a processing facility and get into the brokering business? But because we're very entrepreneurial and we have a beautiful, blessed network of amazing capability. Just again, like Brandon Welch, who is our CEO at Mad Capital, is a stud, a all-star. I mean, pure entrepreneur, big heart, big brain, and can walk into the rooms with some of the biggest investors in the world, like Lucas Walton, Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google and the Schmidt Family Foundation, and convince them to give him money and to support the regenerative transformation. In a similar way, Alex Heilman is our CEO at Mad Markets. So we incubated it inside of our nonprofit. It gave us the opportunity to perfect that. And when we're ready to go to market, the first idea was, let's go buy Timeless in Ohm, Montana, just outside of Great Falls. And our investors who we went to, we had relationships with, said, taking a place that's doing a couple $1 million and improving it to 30% higher, that's not really a big scale, big amplification, big idea. But what if you bought a bunch of those? What if you rolled up a number of those? You created a top co-efficiency, you created localized investment vehicles, SPVs. That could be interesting. So that's what we launched with Mad Market. So we were able to sort of understand what those dynamics were. We started to identify capability and talent so that we could support it properly. We spent a lot of time with Dave and his team on site to understand what our role was, what the relationships were, in that location, and how we were going to ultimately collaborate and put our heads together and make it work, where the gaps were, what needed to be addressed. So that's allowed us to come in and have meaningful and, again, in alignment with our agronomic support to be able to work with these farmers to get their product to market in an optimal way. The other side of that, of course, is the market making. It's the brokering. So we are supplying ingredients and materials or crops to industrial food providers, to commercial providers, to wholesale, as well as ingredients to some companies that you probably, when you go to the supermarket, probably put inside your basket. So it's allowed us to really start to explore that idea of how can we optimize the value of the farmers who've made those commitments, kind of going back to our early part of the conversation.
I just want to pause here for a moment and double click on this for the listeners out there. We've had a few people in the Regen Ag space come on, and we've talked about carbon markets and we've talked a lot about finance. But one thing we haven't talked a lot about is the regional infrastructure. And I think it's a part of the missing middle that often goes unseen. To the consumer, again, with oversimplification, the farmer just needs to do better on the land. And there needs to be a consumer demand for it. But understanding how to actually facilitate that, there has to be the regional infrastructure in the middle. And, most people just don't think about it because their relationship with food is at the supermarket and it's not in their backyard or on a farm. We started this conversation with interdependence, and you guys are really trying to provide these wraparound services and doing a good job. And it's so critical. And I think it's just one thing that really is really easy to miss if you don't understand the architecture of the food system itself.
I appreciate you grabbing that point. Look, if you want to break it down into two words, local wins. And that's not to say we resist amplification or scaling. We know how that works, and we know that we're subject to it. So even if you wanted to avoid it, you're not going to avoid it. But fundamentally, what local is, it's a framework for collaboration and interdependent, that radical collaboration that's necessary. And what's beautiful about it is because it doesn't distract you, it brings you back to self-awareness and consciousness, which is the building block of meaningful collaboration, systems thinking, because we're now aligning, we're bringing regenerative practices and principles in our organizing structure into a system, an ecological system that needs to be practiced with, regenerative principles. So you can't create an inorganic system to come in and address a organic, ecological, regenerative system meaningfully without that awareness, without that consciousness shift. People run at it with all these great problems. There's a million ag tech companies that are coming up with some amazing innovations. But if they live in a silo, it's just not going to land in a way. It's going to end up creating another oscillation of effect with people that are going to grab it for an optimization. It's going to be very siloed. It's going to find its funding. It's going to find its money, and it's going to be supported. And it may be purchased by a couple of big players, but you're going to continue to see the degeneration of the land. You're going to continue to see smaller farmers perish. You're going to continue to see these rural communities disappear. That won't go there unless it's integrated into a system approach. So the beauty of, bioregionalism is a term that it has been embraced by some people beautifully, like Samantha Powers and others. John Fullerton's done a beautiful job of articulating that. It's understood in theory and principle, but in practice, there's some pretty good sunlight between the way people talk about it and actually practice it. So that notion of really starting with that self-awareness. I mean, local really starts with you. It starts right here. You can't avoid that piece to it. You bring that out and you start to layer that into your own self-awareness and humility and what's necessary in collaboration. There was a really great article, and I don't know, it was yesterday or the day before, but it was essentially questioning the notion of a constitutional Congress. And it was being brought up in the context of really, really smart people. There was something that got famous a while back, the Techno-Optimist Manifesto, right? I don't know if it was Andreessen or Sachs that wrote it, but it essentially was a bit of in my mind anyway, my take on it was somewhat dismissive and somewhat, a sense of hopelessness about the trajectory of the human race, and that if we didn't innovate our way into these solutions, then we were all fucked. I can see why somebody might land on that, but I can also see how somebody would land on that when they isolate themselves away from these natural systems and spend more time investing in a radical collaboration and in their own self-awareness. So again, it's not a binary good or bad. Yes, please, techno bros, figure that other stuff out. But before we go to Mars, let's think about the idea of how these systems work. And this country has done so many amazing things. And I don't want to take me off the topic of what we're talking about with MAD, but I think it's implicit in what we do. The notion of bringing a whole bunch of people together to work on something, and then identifying delegates to basically capture those good ideas, and then to bring forth a ratification of the ones we're going to work on, where there's truly localized governance. And governance is a big word. I take it very seriously as a board member of MADAG. I have a governance fiduciary accountability. It goes beyond fiduciary even. I have a responsibility to the staff to not over-involve myself, even though I'm probably over-involved. But the idea of governance as a principle and a framework for establishing the way people work is something that I think sometimes we just blow past and go forward to very shiny solutions. And investment is in such a challenged, tension-filled place. We need money, we need capital. But if it's living within the existing paradigms of investment, with VC level returns and the expectations of detached investors that are waiting to hear about their returns without any real meaningful participation in the ideas that they're trying to support, or even a superficial understanding of it so that it aligns with their expectations, or they can build their expectations properly, we end up repeating the same problems again and again. Mm-hmm. So, Mad Capital is implicitly built around the rhythm of the transition. And that's what our guys do really, really well. That's why we've been able to raise another $80 million in our perennial fund too. That's why it was able to create confidence with some very sophisticated investors who are using their resources to help to further and ignite the regenerative revolution. But that stuff all still comes back to fundamentally that idea of that consciousness shift, that regionalized, bioregionalized, localized thinking, and to embrace those principles in such a way, get that right, and then start to stitch together a bigger system where people are working together and people do understand that interdependence.
Robbie, you referred to market making as unsexy, I think, a few minutes ago. And you're talking to the wrong guys when you say stuff like that. As organizational development, systems thinking junkies, we would love to hear more about all of that. So
I appreciate that.
I want to go back and just summarize some of the things you've said so far. So first, you're talking about on the investment
Very
side,
helpful.
patient capital, right?
Yeah.
For those who didn't grasp that, right? The time to profitability when a farmer is making the transition could be right up to 5 years, correct?
Yes.
Yep. So we need capital, which like you said, is more patient than quarterly returns. And so you guys are
Yeah.
establishing that huge piece of the puzzle. Agronomic support, right? You're helping farmers get all of the materials and knowledge they need to make transition and giving them all the support they need, the individualized planning. And then you talk about this market making piece, right? Making sure that there
Yes.
is a place for them to sell their goods once they've built it. And that,
Absolutely.
like Ian is saying, we've talked to some people on this pod on the Regen, and they've all identified that as a really critical missing piece. And so I came across some examples learning about MedAg. I was wondering if you could tell us about some of the regional projects that you guys have actually gotten involved in, so people can get a sense of what that looks like.
Yeah. A couple of projects I'll kind of rattle through. The grain chain, I sit on the board of the Colorado Grain Chain, full disclosure as well. And, you know, Colorado is our headquarters, so to speak, Boulder. But we have a national footprint. We have regional offices throughout the country. Each region is represented. Really happy about the fact I'm a New Orleans native, and we'll probably talk a little bit about that. But really happy that we've got our teeth into a few projects in the Southeast. And, not only is that an amazing, agricultural region, there's all the tension associated with, slavery and other elements that sort of were, inextricable or inseparable from the agricultural system there in terms of just the sort of justice, social justice, environmental justice that exists within those regions. So very, very happy about that. But with the grain chain and the revival of that, the recognition of working with local farmers and essentially, if you go back to what's really behind the grain movement in Colorado, it really is a recognition that there are 5 major watersheds in Colorado that effectively water the entire Southwest, right? So, from the mountains that run 10 miles behind where I sit here today talking to you, and with a nice big heave, I can almost hit Long's Peak, which is the headwaters, effectively, the Colorado River. It's rather significant. So the use of that water is motivating when it comes to our agricultural systems and the integration of crops that are better suited towards this part of the world. In general, they should be less thirsty than not, right? So we want to make sure we're using our water resources correctly. So the ability for us to help not only work with seed growers and other amazing farmers to help to identify, these varieties of wheats that are well adapted, that can be rotated into the cropping system in order, to promote soil health and other features, and of course to help to support in the market making as well. And there's so much energy around that, and this is how it kind of backs into a place like Colorado, but it's not exclusive to Colorado. But when life gives you lemons, make lemonade kind of thing. In Colorado, we make a lot of beer. We do a lot of distilled spirits. That's sort of part and parcel. We ski a little bit, we hike a little bit, we climb a little bit, but we also make a lot of beer. We drink a lot of beer, and we make a lot of spirits.
You're thirsty
And
after all that hiking, let's be honest.
it just works together. It's perfect, right? What's better than a great IPA after some
Yeah.
kind of massive personal best on a mountain. But
Yeah.
the a number of grains used in the production of those products is significant. So much more than, not that we love our bakers and we love our pasta makers and everyone else, but it's volume by magnitude. So the ability to not only grow these interesting products, but also to participate and collaborate on flavor, which is the other really exciting thing. As you probably are aware, arguably speaking, both of those industries are a bit overserved, and there's been declines in alcohol consumption. There's maybe a few too many craft brewers out there, but there's a lot of creativity and a lot of dedication within that. So the ability to reference particular grains and origin and flavor profiles and characteristics and features is something that also shows up really powerfully in the market. So we get to participate in all those things, not only working with growers And in particular, Masa Seed, big shout out to those guys, Dan Hobbs and Nana Meyer at Pueblo Seed Company. There's so many others that are just doing fantastic work to grow seeds, grow plants for seed that are locally adapted. And then we work with those guys to make sure that, the farmers have access to them, and then the opportunity for that to ultimately contribute to products that people get to enjoy, that can drive some business for people, all of those elements. And then, of course, it's all driven by the fact that those products are right for the land. The Rye Resurgence Project is one I have to give a special shout out to. That was a recognition by a local farmer, Sarah and Michael Jones, down in the San Luis Valley, primarily potato growers, but they grow a lot of other stuff, and recognized that after harvest in the fall, late winter, into winter, when all the crops were harvested, you typically had a lot of bare land there and had these massive Dust Bowl events. So a Dust Bowl event sounds like a bad thing because it's a lot of, hard to breathe, bad air. It also, all that happens to be your topsoil. So all that fertile topsoil is now being blown away into New Mexico or Kansas or Oklahoma or wherever. And, that's far less than ideal. That's contrary to the principles of regenerative. So Sarah went out and raised some money and started something called the Rye Resurgence Project, brought a team of folks together. And so to provide access to those seeds that are adapted beautifully for the wintertime. So in order to cover the soil in the winter months, and then the ability for all of us to put our heads together to help to amplify that program, get more farmers involved in it, and then to get makers using that rye. And a number of the farmers, Sarah in particular, are growing those as regenerative organic certified rye. Sarah, I think, was first. And that's a meaningful product benefit when you go to market. So if you're buying a rye and the rye is made from a rye seed, a rye plant that comes from a program that's helping to protect that rural community and the fertility and the soil and the ability for those rural communities to continue and to essentially be successful, and you're able to harvest that rye and put it in a bottle and get the public involved in that, use it as a bit of an education thing, and even if it's not, enjoy a nice glass of rye. Those are the type of dots connecting that we like to do. There's a distiller here in Boulder County, Dryland, and Nels Rowe, and not only has, and here's another sort of catalytic impact of putting those things in motion. So this is how we kind of want the world to work. Nels recognized that each bottle is about 20 to 22 pounds of rye in a bottle of rye. So when you distill it through the process, that's significant, again. So, as opposed to a pound or two in a loaf of bread. And the value add in that bottle of rye is significant. That rye is selling for over $100 a bottle. So it's not a cheap bottle. There's a value add to that. And the ability to put that into influential places is significant. And also, again, because it gives you some market claims, it starts to attract attention. So all of a sudden, Nels was getting calls from all over the country from other people who were starting to, hit some limits, running out of runway on their new distilleries or their old distilleries, and said, how can we get a hold of some of this regenerative organic certified rye? And that inspired Nels and his partner, Ron Popma, to purchase a facility in Longmont, Colorado, near his distillery. And this will be the first organic certified grain mill in the country. And this will allow greater amplified access to that product. So it'll continue to not only support the program in the San Luis Valley that Sarah started to protect that region, but it'll also provide for other growers to grow, to have incentive, and to find markets for their rye. And MADAG gets to play a significant role in connecting those dots, helping those farmers get on land, help with that market making, and ultimately support the connection between those makers and those growers. That's a good day right there, Justin. That's a really, really good day, and that's an example of the sort of opportunities that can exist for us. Another project that we're really, really happy to be working on is a bison reintroduction project with the Cherokee Arapaho tribe in Oklahoma. And first of all, there's so much to be said about indigenous wisdom, and I could absolutely derail this conversation talking about the time I spent with Marcus. Marcus is a member of the Muskogee Nation, based out of Alabama, but with tribal presence in Oklahoma, where the Trail of Tears led, as well as in South Florida, and actually also in my native Louisiana, with the Homa tribe. And the advocacy of what we heard in preserving that sacred and preserving what's sacred about that fidelity to land and that ability to work with those land stewards and bringing product forward is so present in our work with the tribes in Oklahoma. The fundamental work is anchored, like most work that matters, on trust, right? It moves at the speed of trust. I mean, these are people that have, experienced so many indignities, and the opportunity for our team to work with the tribe to reimagine the reintroduction of bison, which, as you know, are so integral to their culture and their history and their foodways, and to begin the envisioning of what that reintroduction would look like and what's necessary to support it successfully. What sort of levels of participation does the tribe wish to bring into that reintroduction? And ultimately, what kind of markets can we make for that? What sort of opportunities can we create for that? There's also ritual that's so present in that's been, oftentimes taken or denied of the tribes. And, again, without misrepresenting this, the idea that the taking of the bison was so much a part of the identity and the culture and the ritual on the tribes. So all of that's implicit in that, and that is such a remarkable opportunity for our team to come in and use our talents. We hired a tribal member who also is just a badass agronomist, Ray, to come in and lead that project on the ground. And so that we're learning from her. We're learning from the tribesmen. We're deepening our understanding of indigenous wisdom, which is so fundamental to our ability to be good agronomists and good technical supporters. As a result of that, we've also opened up a conversation. So in addition to that project, that's led to an opportunity to partner in New Mexico with tribes there, with the Pueblos, in supporting agricultural systems there as well. So amazing privilege, amazing instruction and information and ability for us to deepen the work that we do in the unique ways that we do it. And then the last project I'll mention, and there are many, many more, is our collaboration with Whole Foods on what we're calling the Wilding Program.
And good, I was hoping you would mention this one.
Yeah, this one is really close to us, and we play in the brand world. Boulder is, arguably the capital of the modern natural organic food movement. New Hope, which is really the center of it, who sponsors the big Super Bowl of organic and natural food, the expo in Anaheim, where over 100,000 delegates. So everything you've ever seen in an Erewhon, in a Whole Foods, in a Sprouts, in the natural section at Kroger's, it all starts in this place. So this is where the brands emerge, the pioneers. It's where the ingredient companies come out. It's where the trends come out. And it's where the packaging and all the infrastructure for the packaged food industry sort of shows up. We've always had plenty of presence in that. My background, I've done a number of CPG brands. Our founder, Phil, participated actively in that. If you're in Boulder, Colorado, you're participating in that. And many of the investors that are now transitioning into Regenerative come from that background. So it's natural, and it's not that big of a reach for Whole Foods to say, hey, Mad Ag, we have some curiosity about what you guys are doing with prairie strips. It's not a new concept, been around for a long time, that idea of an integration of land that's allowed to remain wild, so to speak, for pollinator and habitat health, and ultimate contributions to the land ecology. It affects water containment, runoff, and holding. There's a lot of benefits to the land itself, but essentially, this project with Whole Foods is utilizing land that's not in production in the traditional sense, right? It's not growing a crop that you're going to harvest and take to market with you. So this is land that you wouldn't necessarily plant, but it's adjacent to the the land that you are using for your farm. So what to do with that land, to think productively about that, to think regeneratively about that is something that is very natural for Mad Ag. We've developed seed mixes and a number of things. One of our team members, Omar, is he is the Prairie Strip Whisperer. You know, this is a guy who absolutely lives the life. He lives in the driftless region of Wisconsin. He writes beautifully on it. He creates art to, you know, bring a sensibility to it, to bring a true sort of connection, a spiritual connection to this kind of agronomic process. So we had a lot of things in place, but the way that Whole Foods approached it, which was amazing, you know, all the way up to the CEO and their sustainability team, was to come out and learn about how this works. And they got so excited, enthusiastic about it, went back to their team and said, we want to get involved. We want to make this thing happen. So we're starting with a pilot project in Wisconsin, but the design is on 65 million acres of land that sits in proximity to managed agricultural land. And this is land that has the potential to not only aid, again, in the regenerative practices, the fertility, the yield and production on the agricultural land. It has massive opportunities to contribute to rich biodiversity, to aesthetic qualities, and ultimately we think of this as kind of a super highway of land that's being returned to the wild. And we do call it wilding, not rewilding, and that's intentional as well. Rewilding is a term of art. You'll hear it a lot in, you know, this field and adjacent fields. Rewilding sort of implies a bit of a fetishness, a little bit of an idea that it kind of avoids the anthropomorphic or the anthropocenic world that we live in, right? And we know right now, you know, it's kind of up to us to be intentional and accountable to the fact that we have disrupted natural flows. You know, agricultural land is manipulated land. It is human managed land by definition. So the idea that lands that are in adjacencies would be influenced, so to speak, manipulated, if you will, but in a way that is aligned with that ecosystem, in a way that allows for wilderness, for biodiversity to return to that land and to benefit from that land, and access to that land is something we're excited by. So in addition to Whole Foods making a $500,000 matching grant contribution to this, of which we've been able to participate with Whole Foods in bringing a number of brands that have committed themselves to regenerative agriculture in their ingredients. Some big names like Applegate and Campbell and others that are out there. We've got a big team. I think we're oversubscribed in terms of the people that want to participate. And we are really excited about not only the ability to help to manage that, but also thinking about it's a 3-year commitment on the part of Whole Foods. We hope they're around for 3 years. And we are not leaving anything to chance. We are building this for durability. So the idea that now this has begun, we're the kind of people, we understand time, we're building this thing to last for a long, long time. So yeah, those are 3 very different types of projects, Justin, that we work with. And there are many that, you know, they're smaller scale, quite fundamental ideas where a farmer's saying, I grow a couple crops, and I'd like to maybe increase that diversity. I want to embrace regenerative practices. And those are, you know, day in, day out work of creating a farm plan, making sure it's economically viable, making sure the resources are available to them, and making things happen. But let's just say this, that there's well and way more demand than there is supply for those farmers that are coming into your earlier question, Ian.
Yeah. Well, and again, I want to pause here and if I can make an attempt to try and synthesize the importance of back to this regional infrastructure thing for the listeners out there. And I understand that for those who aren't necessarily acquainted with the regenerative movement, sometimes it seems like we've all like, drunk the same Kool-Aid, which I think is very real in many ways.
Yeah.
But to understand the importance of, like, to go back to the rye example, right? We need to cover crops so that we don't have dust bowl events. Or here in the Midwest where we live, Twin Cities, Minnesota, we've got farmers putting in drain tiles. To put that in context, why is it important to keep topsoil on the land? Well, one, at this point, it's one of our country's largest exports, right? We don't talk a lot about it, but we are washing a ton of topsoil off. And that obviously has implications for food production, but soil is the number one carbon sink, land-based carbon sink, right?
100%.
And so then to go back to your second example of, the reintroduction of the buffalo, it's like back to this notion of integrated food systems, right? Agriculture, it didn't evolve on its own. It co-evolved with animals, right? And so these ecosystems are embedded. And then, like, finally here with the driftless region, which is one that hits home for us, this notion of, like, food is oftentimes the most direct access to nature for people, right? If you're not fortunate enough to live in the foothills of, the Colorado Rockies, or if you're not fortunate enough to even be able to take time off and spend time in the wilderness, right? Like I just got back from a short trip to the Boundary Waters. Food is your
Nice.
interaction with nature so
Yeah.
often, right? Like it's on your table every single day. And
Sure.
that is a direct avenue or a direct gateway into why does this stuff matter?
Yeah.
And if we can figure out how to not only produce it in sustainable, ethical, or regenerative ways, but then also convey the importance of it and make it accessible for people who might not necessarily even care to understand the whole systems thinking view of it, I just think it's so critical, and to be able to do that in such a way that not only provides space for people to access nature through food, but also to produce food in such a way that regenerates nature. It is this nexus point. It is at the center of the intersection between humans' interaction with nature. And we're not even talking about seed diversity or pollinators or anything else. Obviously, that's all part of the food system. But
Sure.
I just think like it's really to try and just synthesize that for the listeners who might not understand what this Kool-Aid is in the regenerative ag space.
Yeah.
This is why we all get so passionate about it, because we
Yes.
understand that if we can knock this domino over, even though it's going to take, a collective effort to do so, that domino run is so long and it's going to have such a positive beneficial impact long term that it's worth fighting for until our dying days.
Yeah. To your point, and thank you for the synthesis. Wendell Berry's famous quote is that, eating is an agricultural act, right? So, it's about as elegant and simple an idea as you probably need to hold on to, which is why, again, we bring it back to the notion that it does, the revolution needs to be irresistible. And so that irresistibleness is what you experience with your eyes when you see a beautiful place, or maybe just the great vibe you get when you walk through a farmer's market or meet a farmer. It's certainly in the delicious experience of not only eating, the pleasure that comes with that, but the ritual and the custom and the memory that, people understand so well. So, if you go up and down that ecosystem, love to talk about the idea of, the chef's as last mile. And, that can play in a lot of ways, but fundamentally, the ability for us to work with amazing chefs and, that are creating great foods, or makers that are creating a great whiskey, those are moments of pleasure and community that we all get an opportunity to experience, and it's all available to us. And there's so many reasons, in the expression of that pleasure, or so many opportunities perhaps, to participate in this system in ways that just doesn't require a big lecture, or, it might be a few clicks more expensive, and I don't want to dismiss that because those pennies matter. Anybody who's ever
Absolutely.
launched a CPG brand will, so many of the brands that come out of here, they aim for the moon. We're going to create the next fill in the blank that's going to change the way people eat or relate to food for nutritional purposes, for sourcing purposes, and so many wonderful entrepreneurs. And then you get into the knife fight that is retail and distribution and investors, and it's the death by a thousand cuts opportunity. And I think we overplay that sometimes. And again, that premium seldom finds its way back to the farmer. It does sometime, there's a bit of a running joke, and this is, there's a lot of dirty secrets out there, and maybe they're not secrets anymore. I don't know. But if you get in a room and you got a mixture of policy guys and farmers and agronomists and NGO types and food makers, if there's a farmer out there that's, a strapping, handsome guy or a beautiful woman, man, they're beating off the CPG brands that want to source from that farmer and put their picture on the cover of it.
Right.
But when you talk to some of those people, it's like we're trying to soothe somebody from 6 years ago that won't take our picture off, that stopped paying us and using our ingredients. It's like that's just, it sort of underscores the idea of we just got to avoid that fetish bullshit stuff. It's like, I mean, there's a couple of things you can break it down to. That pleasure and that intimate connection to nature with eating is fundamental. And, nobody needs a lecture on the fact that eating better foods is better for you, right? It's just, we understand the nutrition that's implicit in foods and probably shouldn't be coming from, supplements. And, all due respect, Peter Attia and Andrew Huberman, the biohacking thing has its limits as well, right? There's still some fundamentals at work here. They've been around for a little while, even the ecology that exists in our own bodies. You're more microbial than you are human on a cellular basis. Mm-hmm. So, that's a pretty profound sort of thing at the end of it. But, the other idea is that, another fundamental reality is that we just need to make it cheaper and stop burdening the farmer. It just make it easier for the farmer to do their job. Stop asking them to do more without some reward and incentive. And I think, again, if you were drawing the concentric circles, it is, eating is an agricultural act. It is food is pleasure and culture and memory and all those things that we can embody without anybody talking to us. We can just close our eyes and go there right away. And then, buy foods that probably are more local than not, and that are good for your body. Eat more of the good ones and not so many of the bad ones. We kind of get that one as well. But that idea of addressing the farmer's needs is somewhere in those first couple of concentric circles, I think, right? It's like they go to the trouble, they take on the risk. They got to live with the fact that nature is capricious, and there's all kind of whiplash going on inside of the ecology or the climate that they're working in. So there's all those things happening in the marketplace, and then they're getting all these mixed signals from the markets, like, oh, I want strawberries all year, or whatever it is. And it's like, maybe that's not such a good idea as well, but there's a market for strawberries all year. We would be kind of freaking out. Or I don't know if you guys have kids, but, a lot of times if you got a 4-year-old, it's like, I want my strawberries in the middle of wintertime. It's like, yeah, there are hothouses growing that, or we can ship them in from somewhere, but they're really, really good, in the early summer and spring, and a lot of places in the world. And it's really nice when you can celebrate the arrival of that. I think, again, we intuitively understand that. But, as you move out those concentric circles, there's a pretty compelling report put out by some really credible people that puts the cost of the ramifications of a poorly designed food system at about $12 trillion a year just in healthcare costs alone.
Yeah.
And then on one of the other outer rings. So those externalities, those true costs are not present in the food you buy.
So, Robbie, one thing we like to do with every guest is we like to give them an opportunity to speak directly to the audience, right, for any support or messages they'd like to deliver. So 2 questions. One of them is, what is the highest leverage system level change that would help move the sustainable agriculture movement forward in your mind?
I'm going to repeat myself a bit, but I do think the idea that local wins is actually the big idea, kind of wrapped in a very small package. It's hard to think about any one thing that would be more important than to have groups of people organize, align themselves within a governance model that allows for people to work interdependently together. I think that's the part we keep missing in the system. Again, coming from Climate Week with all the beautiful people in the room, and there are many conferences like that. Tierra Madre is going on for slow food in Sacramento right now as we speak. And it's oftentimes, I think the desire is for all that good intention to be thrown at the wall in a number of different directions, and maybe it comes together for a conference, and then people go away, and there's some competing interests that happens quite a bit. We didn't touch on Maha and all the stuff that goes into that, but that ability for people that kind of recognize local food systems, where their food comes from, the things we talked about, the ritual. If we can get people to really kind of work from that point of their own relationship to their local food systems and the opportunity to work together and support farmers within their regions, and to make sure that there's an opportunity and identification of the resources that are necessary at that local level, I think that's where the system change really will bubble up from. Again, I think it also allows for there to be economic support that's much more aligned with the interests of all those ecosystem players, so that it's not just held by a few and doesn't bubble up to, there's 4 major food companies in the world. And when it gets played at that level, it tends to be very distant from the level that we'd like to see regenerative practiced. So that's both a system level as well as kind of a what you can do in a lot of ways. I mean, you can designate a delegate or you can participate in that process. But I think what you'd find is that the growers in most regions are actually eager to hear from people and are looking for the opportunity to connect. And they don't want to be overburdened. Again, people that are growers have a lot of things on their plate, but the opportunity for local systems to say, what can we do to support those systems? Right here in Boulder right now, on the ballot coming up is a conversation about minimum wage. And it's a very tension-filled conversation for all the reasons you'd expect, because I think everybody would like to see people make a few more dollars, at the lower end of the economic spectrum. But the problem for local farmers is that significant increase in the minimum wage, it probably would be impossible to sustain. So now you're running into some of the conversations around immigration and access to immigrant labor, and again, arguably the jobs that certain people want to do and certain jobs that people don't want to do. So those are the kind of things that are best addressed by conversations at the local level. That's not one that you want people to show up at some removed or distant level making a decision that's not right for the community. And we need to talk it through, argue about it, but ultimately arrive at a decision that's going to work for the system. And what I find is, again, people that are not acquainted with the economics of a farm, or maybe from the story from a farmer or a couple of farmers so they can objectify it, are so full-throatedly supportive of an increased minimum wage at a policy level, so to speak, at a government level. And once they learn more about the economics on the farms that they actually know and have experienced through their farmers markets in other ways, have adopted a little bit of a different attitude towards, that sort of governance. It's a good example of why it makes sense for people to be able to organize themselves within the context of regions where it makes a difference to them. So.
Yeah, and that's a perspective that obviously has legs well beyond agriculture.
It really does. It really does. So much of my experience with regional thinking, cooperative thinking, so to speak, comes from work that I do outside of agriculture. But a good friend of mine runs a credit union in San Antonio with a deep fidelity to mission, to the social contract implicit in credit unions. And the ability to practice finance essentially within credit unions or banks, both regulated financial institutions, they bubble up to the same requirements, so to speak, in terms of behavior. But credit unions are tax exempt, and their social contract is ultimately to serve those gaps in the market, which oftentimes are people that are more ignored. And in order to do that, it's just so well, it goes so far beyond the idea of saying we're just going to service people who are, getting the short end of the stick. It really does take the participation of an ecosystem of players in it. So it goes far beyond agriculture, to your point. Absolutely. But once you sort of see it, you can't unsee it, that opportunity for people to come together. And there's some beautiful facilitators and participants and wisdom providers in our ability to do that. So it's probably the most obvious solution. I think it's right in front of our nose, maybe sometimes too close to see. But I think that's the one we all need to acquaint ourselves with.
Yeah, and to your point, it's even if you see it, it takes a lot of comfort with argument and comfort
That
with
that,
the
that yeah, the trust your discomfort sort of opportunity, or whatever, the comfortable with uncomfortable. Um, it really does require that, but I do think, like you say, I mean, that extends to every principle within our democracy. I mean, whatever is the ideal that we want to discuss or lift up in this country, somewhere in that is that opportunity for people that have some shared interests, but also plenty of things to disagree with, how to functionally live together and work through it. There's a lot of opportunities there, but the beauty of agriculture is that it does come back to food, and we generally eat a couple times a day, every day. So it's not that abstract.
I think that's as good of a sentiment as any to end our little discussion on, Robbie. So
Excellent.
thanks for
Excellent.
that. It
So,
feels like we went full circle.
yeah, very good. Look, thanks so much for the time to talk a little bit about what we do. So many features and facts. So hopefully get a chance to revisit some of those and see what's new, down there. We're really enjoying our media side of our business. We've continued to bolster that. And that's been such an invitation for people to come in and collaborate. And, kind of to our earlier point, what's nice about that is that, you can explore those adjacencies, the world of outdoor recreation and artists, and find how those things actually connect very nicely to the agricultural conversation, and again bring more of that irresistibility into it, so it attracts more people in ways that I think are not too geeky, not too technical, not too data driven, and hopefully that's a good point of entry.
Yeah. Well, you've done a heck of a job of making the whole thing sound irresistible, Robbie. So appreciate your time.
Good. I appreciate that as well. Thank you guys as well. All right, look, take care, have a good one, and until next time.
Absolutely. We'll be in touch.
All right,
Yeah,
thanks guys.
back to you, Robbie. Big thanks to Robbie Vitrano for being our guest today, and thanks to you for listening. To learn more about Mad Agriculture, go to their website at madagriculture.org. And if you're a mission-driven org looking to grow your impact, check us out at stillpointinsight.com.